Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and today we're going to talk about one of the basic concepts that you need to be prepared to know about that you can use as an effective lens throughout the rest of the course this semester in order to properly compare and contrast governmental, social, cultural, and economic systems of the different countries that we're going to talk about. So here it is. Today is our lecture on the comparative method. So what we're trying to figure out here, and what you're going to be tasked with knowing is that you have to learn how to compare the similarities and the differences between states in order to gain a deeper understanding of political forces. And the comparative method is really the reason that this class exists, to develop primarily these skills, as well as give you some basic knowledge about 6 of the countries of the world. But this is really the reason why the College Board created the AP program, was because they find value in this particular method and its application specifically to political science. So it's important to be systematic in how you compare. So deciding what to compare is critical. Comparatists use both inductive and deductive reasoning techniques to develop hypotheses and gather evidence with the goal of identifying patterns of behavior. One of the common methods used to obtain information is using surveys. But when you develop surveys, a lot of them can be derived either from deductive or inductive thinking. As we see on the chart on the PowerPoint, deduction would be to come up with a theory and then promote a hypothesis in order to test that theory. You would then observe in order to find out the ways in which your hypothesis is either incorrect or correct. And then through those many observations or tests, you would come up with confirmation or negation of the theory that you derived in the first place. And this can be seen through today as we use the scientific method. And it's one of the methods that Aristotle first used in order to test his theories. That is deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning would be first to see an observation and then find that pattern, and then come up with a hypothesis or an argument based on first observing and then seeing a pattern. And then finally, you can develop a theory from that hypothesis that you were able to gather. So you didn't have an intent, you didn't have a theory or hypothesis first, but the first thing that was done was observe and kind of let it come to you. That's one of the ways that we can see that Sherlock Holmes would act. So as we said, one of the most common methods used to obtain information is using surveys. A properly conducted survey uses random sampling and can provide important insights about political behavior. Here we see the political surveys, and for some reason they were significantly errant in the 2016 election to be wildly inaccurate. And we had some states that didn't even think were in play for President Trump that ended up being, that he ended up winning, like Wisconsin and Minnesota, places where he wasn't campaigning, and really Clinton wasn't campaigning either, because they didn't even know that they were in play because of the errant sampling. There's been a lot of theories that have dealt with why those surveys were inaccurate in the first place. But the most important thing when it comes to sampling is that you use random sampling. And the reason is that because you want to avoid something that we'll talk about here in a minute, which is selection bias. But we'll discuss selection bias here in the first. The first thing when we discuss different surveys, you're either looking for a causation or a correlation. Oftentimes there'll be an apparent association, and we call that a correlation, between two variables, but it is difficult to prove causation when one variable causes an effect on the other variable. Causation is particularly difficult to prove in comparative politics because of the small number of states available for study. Combine that with the difficulty of conducting surveys in repressive authoritarian environments or surmounting language barriers. Comparatists also must be wary of selection bias that we'll discuss in a minute. But first, let's discuss causation and correlation. Here we have a graph that shows ice cream sales and shark attacks, and they have similar trajectories. So one could infer, based on correlation, that ice cream causes shark attacks, but in reality, it's more likely that the summer months and more people are in the ocean, and shark attacks happen when more people are in the ocean, and they also swim closer to shore during that time, and instead of being related to ice cream sales. But this is actually that correlation is something that has caused problems in the past. We're going to watch this video really quickly. So we see, even with what we're experiencing right now, it's difficult to, in terms of pandemic, to see exactly what is a correlation, what is a causation. And when you're dealing with states and a random sample and different governments, it can often become even more difficult. But nonetheless, that is the job of a comparatist, in order to try and compare and contrast and theorize based on the research that you're able to accumulate. Let's talk about selection bias for a minute. Okay, selection bias is the bias introduced by the selection of individuals, groups, or data for analysis in such a way that proper randomization is not achieved, thereby ensuring that sample obtained is not representative of the population intended to be analyzed. And this is one thing that you can see in the current polls. You hear a lot of Republicans and even the White House claiming that not enough Republicans are being sampled in the polls that show Joe Biden leading President Trump by anywhere from 7 to 12% in the national polls currently. And so you see this accusations of selection bias, and the reason is because if your data doesn't come from a random sample, then it can't be representative. So if you're targeting certain groups, then that poll obviously isn't worth a lot. And if you go to 538, you can actually see the way that different polls are graded based on the size of the poll and based on the randomization itself. And so it's important to see that and know that there are different qualities of polls based on how large the sample is and based on how random it is to prevent selection bias from happening. So, yet despite the challenges, comparative inquiry is a fascinating way to approach the study of politics, not only because of the empirical or factual conclusions that can be drawn into the evidence, but also the normative or value-related assertions that may be made about political behavior. On the AP exam that you'll see this year, you can be asked to identify several types of these statements or to use data to create your own. And so when we kind of examine that empirical versus normative statements are generally value-laden judgments and often contains words like should or should not, better or worse. They're value statements, but empirical statements just describe what is in the social world without evaluating it. So just empirical facts. They're statements, okay, that can be measured empirically. So a lot of the times in politics today, you see the blurring of these between normative and empirical statements. You see empirical statements right now in our political discourse that are being second guessed and blurred, and it's like, well, you know, each side has a different version of the truth, but in reality, comparatists will say that empirical statements are true regardless of which side says them. And obviously we can measure data and that there's political slants to things, but when it comes back to it, there should be empirical truths that we can examine in order to base political opinions and political theories around. Now, normative statements, those are value-laden, so those can always be discussed and disagreed upon and debated, but empirical statements are supposed to just be true statements that we can take for value and that should not be questioned in political discourse. So let's end today's short lecture with some examples. The first one is an empirical versus normative, and see if you all can tell the difference. So the question is, which of the following statements makes an empirical conclusion and which one is a normative statement? All right, so I hope everyone has their thinking caps on because you're about to have a little bit of an oral quiz. So the A statement, okay, 63% of Nigerians have a favorable view of China. And the graph actually says 70, so we'll just change the statement to 70. So 70% of Nigerians have a favorable view of China. Is this a normative statement or an empirical statement? The second statement is B. The Chinese government should continue to fund development programs in Nigeria. So is this an empirical statement or a normative statement? That the Chinese government should continue to fund development programs in Nigeria. The answer? Statement A is empirical and statement B is normative. Statement A is empirical because it is factual. It's a descriptive statement drawn from a Pew Global poll that states that 70% of Nigerians have a favorable view of China. Whereas in statement B is a normative one because it is a prescriptive assertion about what the Chinese government should do. That's not empirical. It's taking valuable information and saying something that they should do, but it's normative because it's still a value judgment. All right, example 2, correlation or causation. So you have to figure out which of the following statements shows a correlation and which one shows a causal statement. All right, A. A majority of the people in both Nigeria and China have a favorable view of China. All right, we got a couple of headlines here, how the Chinese are taking over Nigeria's economy, as well as the investment of Chinese companies in Nigeria's worth. And then we have our B statement. An increase in foreign direct investments boost economic growth in a country. Again, an increase in foreign direct investments boost economic growth in a country. So which one is a correlation and which one is a causation? Answers. All right, statement C shows a correlation in that there is an apparent relationship between the two populations about a favorable view of China. So statement C is just a correlation. It's just, hey, People in Nigeria like China, and people in China like China. So that just shows a correlation between the two. Statement D is a causal statement, okay, because that it asserts that one action, an increase in foreign direct investment, has a direct effect on economic growth. All right. And that will end our lecture today. I hope that everyone was able to learn a little bit about the comparative method. And please make sure that this is something that you're very comfortable with and the ideas and vocabulary surrounding it, because it will govern almost all of the work that we'll do in this class from here on out.